Brent crude jumped more than 7% in a single afternoon, spiking past $111 a barrel. West Texas Intermediate climbed roughly 4%, crossing the $100 mark. Qatar, the second largest exporter of liquefied natural gas on the entire planet, responsible for something close to 1/5 of global LNG supply, had just watched Iranian ballistic missiles slam into Ras Laffan Industrial City, the single largest LNG production and export complex in the world. 3 separate fires broke out. Qatar Energy confirmed extensive damage. And within hours, Qatar's government had declared Iranian military and diplomatic personnel persona non grata, ordering them out of the country within 24 hours. That is not a summary or an interpretation. That is exactly what happened, verified by Qatari state media, confirmed by Qatar Energy's own statements, and reflected instantly in energy markets that do not lie about how seriously the world took this particular escalation. And what came after it, once the United States decided it had seen enough, turned this from a regional energy crisis into one of the most consequential military escalations of the entire war. To understand why Iran would even attempt something this reckless, you have to go back one day earlier, because this strike did not happen in isolation. On a Wednesday in mid-March, Israel struck Iran's South Pars gas field, the massive offshore reservoir that sits directly on the maritime border between Iran and Qatar, shared jointly by both countries, even though it carries different names depending on which side of the line you're standing on. That field is Iran's single largest natural gas asset, and hitting it was already a serious escalation on its own, one that sent oil prices climbing even before Iran had fired a single shot in response. Iran's president went on record almost immediately, warning of what he called consequences beyond control, consequences that would, in his words, engulf the entire world. That is not measured diplomatic language. That is the language of a government feeling cornered and trying to project maximum deterrence through rhetoric alone, because at that exact moment, Iran's actual military options for a direct, symmetrical response against Israel were increasingly limited. So Iran did what it has done throughout large portions of this war whenever it felt boxed in against Israel directly. It turned its fire toward the easier targets sitting right next door, the Gulf Arab states that had nothing to do with the original Israeli strike but happened to share critical energy infrastructure, shipping lanes, and geographic proximity with Iran itself. Within about 24 hours of the South Pars strike, Iran hit Ras Laffan in Qatar, and simultaneously launched attacks against the United Arab Emirates, striking the Habshan gas processing facilities and the Bab oil field. Saudi Arabia did not escape either, with Iran targeting the Aramco Ras Tanura refinery, a facility absolutely essential to the kingdom's ability to refine and export its own crude oil. This was not a narrow, single-target retaliation. This was Iran spreading a punitive strike campaign across 3 separate Gulf nations simultaneously, none of whom had launched the strike that supposedly triggered this response in the first place. Qatar's government did not mince words about how it viewed what had just happened to its own sovereign territory. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a statement condemning the attack as a dangerous escalation and a flagrant violation of the state's sovereignty, explicitly calling it a direct threat to Qatar's national security and to the stability of the broader region. That kind of language from a government that has spent years trying to maintain a careful, mediating posture between Iran and the West tells you exactly how seriously Doha took this. Qatar had already strongly condemned Israel's initial strike on South Pars, calling it a dangerous and irresponsible step. So this was not a country reflexively taking one side or the other in the broader conflict. Qatar was, in that moment, simply the country that got hit hardest by both sides pursuing their own separate escalation logic, and its reaction, expelling Iranian personnel within 24 hours, was as close to a formal diplomatic rupture as you can get without an actual declaration. Now here is where the reporting gets even more serious, because Ras Laffan was not the only critical piece of infrastructure damaged in that strike. Satellite imagery, later analyzed by independent researchers, suggested that an Iranian drone or projectile had also successfully struck and significantly damaged a U.S. Space Force early warning radar system stationed in Qatar, a system valued at somewhere around $1.1 billion, described as the largest American radar installation anywhere in the Middle East, and a genuinely critical node in the region's entire missile warning architecture. If that damage assessment holds up, and defense analysts were careful to note that battle damage assessments in a contested information environment always require caution before drawing firm conclusions, then Iran had not simply hit an energy facility, it had potentially blinded or degraded one of the most important pieces of American early warning infrastructure in the entire theater. That is an entirely different category of target than a gas processing plant, and it is exactly the kind of escalation that forces a response measured in something much more serious than diplomatic condemnation. And that response came fast, and it came from the very top. President Trump posted directly on social media, making clear that Qatar had been in no way, shape, or form involved with Israel's original strike on the Iranian gas field, and that Iran's retaliatory attacks against Ras Laffan had been carried out, in his words, unjustifiably and unfairly. But he did not stop at simply condemning the attack. He issued a direct public threat, stating that if Iran struck Qatar's LNG infrastructure again, the United States would massively blow up the entirety of the South Pars gas field with what he described as an amount of strength and power that Iran had never seen or witnessed before. He added that he did not want to authorize that level of violence and destruction given the long-term implications for Iran, but made unmistakably clear that if Qatar's LNG assets were hit again, he would not hesitate to follow through. In the same breath, American officials indicated that Israel would hold off on further strikes against that same Iranian energy site, an unusual bit of coordination clearly designed to try to contain the spiral before it consumed the entire region's energy infrastructure. That threat alone tells you something important about how this war had evolved by this stage. This was no longer simply about missile exchanges and command centers. It had become a war where the actual global energy supply itself was being used as a bargaining chip, with both sides explicitly threatening to destroy the infrastructure that keeps a meaningful share of the planet's homes heated and its industries running. Qatar alone accounts for roughly 1/5 of global LNG exports according to energy market analysts, and the country had already been forced to halt LNG production entirely at both Ras Laffan and Messaid Industrial City, following earlier drone strikes just weeks before this latest missile attack. Every additional disruption to that supply chain rippled outward into global energy markets almost instantly, which is exactly why you saw that immediate 7% jump in Brent crude the moment news of the Ras Laffan strike hit trading floors. But the response from the United States did not stop at a single presidential threat posted online, because by this point in the war, Washington had already committed to a sweeping campaign explicitly designed to dismantle Iran's military infrastructure piece by piece, and the Qatar strike simply added fresh urgency and fresh justification to that campaign. This entire conflict had begun on the 28th of February, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes under a joint operation that killed Iran's supreme leader along with dozens of senior officials in the opening salvo alone. Within the first 10 days of that campaign, CENTCOM had already struck more than 5,000 targets across Iran, while 50 Iranian naval vessels had been damaged or destroyed. The stated objective, laid out explicitly by the CENTCOM commander, was eliminating Iran's ballistic missiles, drones, and naval threats, including the actual manufacturing facilities producing them, alongside a parallel effort to eliminate the threat Iran posed to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. And that campaign was already producing measurable results even before the Qatar strike added fresh momentum to it. Independent defense analysis tracking the conflict noted that Iran's long-range missile and drone salvos had declined by somewhere between 70 and 85% compared to the opening days of the war, a direct consequence of an aggressive, sustained hunt for Iranian missile launchers and drone launch positions across the entire country. That is not a small number. A 70 to 85% reduction in launch tempo means the actual military capacity Iran had to sustain this kind of retaliatory strike campaign was shrinking rapidly, even as the political and rhetorical temperature kept climbing with every new attack on a Gulf energy facility. In effect, Iran was making louder and louder threats about consequences beyond control, at the exact moment its actual physical ability to deliver on those threats was being systematically ground down. It is worth digging a little deeper into exactly how that broader American military campaign was actually structured during this stretch, because the sheer scale of it is easy to lose inside a single number like 5,000 targets. The initial wave on the 28th of February leaned heavily on standoff weapons launched from naval platforms, including Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, fired from a carrier strike group built around the USS Abraham Lincoln, synchronized carefully with Israeli strikes launched from land-based airfields so that both air forces could maintain complementary coverage across Iranian airspace despite operating out of completely different time zones. That kind of synchronization does not happen by accident. It requires an enormous amount of coordination between two separate military command structures, and the fact that it held together as tightly as it did in the opening days of the war tells you this campaign had been planned and rehearsed well before the first missile actually launched. Guided missile destroyers operating alongside that carrier group provided additional strike capacity and air defense coverage, creating a layered naval presence that could both launch offensive strikes and help intercept whatever Iran tried to send back in response. The economic dimension of all this deserves its own moment of attention too, because the ripple effects went well beyond a single afternoon's oil price spike. Estimates on the overall cost of this specific stretch of fighting to the United States alone ran into the tens of billions of dollars within just the first several days, once you account for munitions expenditure, deployed carrier strike group operations, and the logistics of moving that much combat power into a single theater on short notice. On the other side of the ledger, the damage to Gulf energy infrastructure carried its own staggering price tag, with Qatar's halted LNG production at both Ras Laffan and Said alone, representing a meaningful dent in global supply from a country responsible for roughly a fifth of the world's LNG exports. Add in the disruption to Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanura refining capacity and the UAE's Habshan and Bab facilities, and you get a picture of a Gulf energy sector absorbing simultaneous shocks across multiple countries at once. Exactly the kind of scenario that analysts warned could push oil prices toward levels not seen in years if the pattern of strikes on energy infrastructure continued to spread rather than get contained. The human cost of this stretch of the war on the American side alone was already significant by the time the Qatar strike happened. By late March, the Pentagon had confirmed 13 American service members killed during this campaign, 7 of them from direct enemy action, primarily Iranian drone and missile strikes against bases in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia in the war's opening days, and 6 more in a separate non-combat incident when a KC-135 Stratotanker crashed in western Iraq during aerial refueling, a tragedy still under investigation at the time as a possible mid-air collision. Somewhere between 290 and just over 300 additional American service members had been wounded, the vast majority with relatively minor injuries like shrapnel wounds and concussions, though roughly 10 remained seriously wounded at that point. Iranian retaliatory strikes had damaged at least 17 American and Allied military sites scattered across Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain, with some officials describing certain facilities as rendered all but uninhabitable. Estimated damage to infrastructure and equipment across that stretch ran somewhere between $800 million and nearly $2 billion in just the first 2 to 4 weeks of fighting. On the Iranian side, casualty figures varied dramatically depending entirely on who was doing the counting, which tells you something important about how contested the information environment around this war has been from the very beginning. Iran's own health ministry put the toll at roughly 1,900 killed and close to 25,000 injured, a figure that includes a broad mix of both military personnel and civilians. American and Israeli officials, by contrast, claimed a substantially higher toll, citing more than 6,000 Iranian military personnel killed and roughly 15,000 wounded. Independent human rights monitoring groups tracking the conflict put out their own separate estimates, one group counting just over 3,000 killed, with a breakdown across military, civilian, and unclassified categories, including more than 200 children, while another group's tally ran considerably higher, close to 6,500 killed, with the overwhelming majority classified as military losses. That kind of wide variance between sources is completely normal in the fog of an active war, but it underscores just how difficult it is to get a clean, agreed-upon picture of the actual toll this conflict has taken, even months into the fighting. Against that backdrop, you can start to understand exactly why the Qatar strike triggered such an intense response from Washington specifically, beyond just the presidential threat about South Pars. This was a war where the United States had already committed enormous resources, taken real casualties, and set an explicit goal of dismantling Iran's ability to threaten the region's energy infrastructure and shipping lanes. Watching Iran turn around and hit the world's largest LNG facility, located in a country that had absolutely nothing to do with the strike that supposedly justified the retaliation, was exactly the kind of provocation that made continuing and intensifying the existing campaign against Iranian military infrastructure feel not just justified, but necessary. If Iran was willing to hit global energy infrastructure belonging to a neutral third party as a form of retaliation against Israel, the logic inside American planning circles was straightforward. The campaign to dismantle the missile and drone capacity, making that kind of retaliation possible in the first place, needed to accelerate, not slow down. And accelerate it did. The broader Operation Iran was running against the region, tracked by independent analysts under the name Operation True Promise Perfor, had documented 95 separate Iranian strike waves by early April, hitting all 7 target countries within the opening 48 hours alone. The 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain sustained damage. Bases in Kuwait were struck repeatedly. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE, and Ain al-Assad Air Base in Iraq were all hit, with at least 64 American service members sustaining concussive injuries at Ain al-Assad in a single incident. One particularly consequential strike destroyed an advanced American missile defense radar at a base in Jordan, one of only 9 such systems in the entire global American inventory, valued at roughly $300 million. A loss one regional analysis center described bluntly as blinding American eyes across the Middle East. The UAE alone reported detecting more than 1,400 drones and over 240 missiles in just the first week and a half of the war, accounting for more than half of all recorded strikes during that period. Every single one of those numbers represents a target list that American and Allied forces were working through night after night in direct response to exactly the kind of escalation the Qatar strike represented. This was not a war where the United States simply absorbed hits and hoped for the best. Every Iranian strike against a Gulf energy facility, every attack against an allied military base, every escalation aimed at a country that had not directly provoked Iran in the first place, fed directly into a sustained American campaign explicitly designed to grind down Iran's capacity to keep doing exactly that. And the 70 to 85% reduction in Iran's own launch tempo by this stage of the war is the clearest evidence that this campaign was actually working, even as the rhetoric coming out of Tehran kept escalating in the opposite direction. The international diplomatic reaction to this stretch of the war extended well beyond just the Gulf states directly affected. In a joint statement issued in the earliest days of the conflict, the governments of the United States, Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia strongly condemned what they called Iran's indiscriminate and reckless missile and drone attacks against multiple countries in the region, a rare show of unified regional and American messaging against Tehran's escalation. France, Britain, and Germany separately expressed concern specifically about Iranian attacks extending beyond Israel itself into the wider Middle East, recognizing that a war originally framed as a bilateral Israeli-Iranian confrontation had clearly metastasized into something threatening the stability of an entire region. The United Kingdom, notably, reversed its earlier position during this stretch of the war and granted the United States permission to use British bases for what officials described as defensive support operations, opening up access to facilities like Diego Garcia and RAF Fairford for the broader coalition effort, with British officials characterizing strikes on Iranian missile launch sites specifically as a defensive measure rather than an offensive escalation. That kind of shift in a close ally's posture, moving from reluctance to active facilitation, reflects exactly how seriously European governments had come to view the trajectory of this war by the time the Qatar energy strike added yet another layer of urgency to the picture. There's also a broader regional diplomatic dimension worth sitting with here, because the reaction to the Qatar strike was not limited to Doha and Washington. Saudi Arabia's foreign minister issued a public warning that patience across the Gulf was not unlimited, a carefully worded but unmistakable signal that the entire region, not just the countries directly hit, was losing tolerance for a war that kept spilling over into territory and infrastructure that had nothing to do with the original conflict between Israel and Iran. Analysts covering the region at the time openly speculated about whether oil prices could climb as high as $200 a barrel if this pattern of energy infrastructure strikes continued to spread, a genuinely alarming prospect for a global economy already absorbing the shock of a major regional war. Qatar itself, in a separate statement, condemned the targeting of energy facilities in both Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates over the preceding days, explicitly warning that these kinds of attacks posed a serious threat not just to regional stability but to global energy security, maritime navigation, and the environment as a whole. When a country that has spent years positioning itself as a careful, neutral mediator between Iran and the West starts using language that direct, the temperature in the room had gotten genuinely dangerous. There was also a domestic political dimension inside Iran itself during this exact stretch of the war worth noting, because the government was not just managing an external military crisis, it was simultaneously confronting internal instability at the same moment it decided to strike Qatar's energy infrastructure. Reporting from this period described Iran as confronting both external military pressure and potential internal political turmoil at once, with commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz already significantly disrupted and insurance costs for vessels transiting the region spiking sharply even before the Ras Laffan strike added fresh uncertainty to the picture. Some assessments floated during this stretch suggested American planners were working from an estimate that dismantling Iran's core military threat would take somewhere in the range of 4 weeks, a timeline officials described as consistent from the earliest days of planning, acknowledging the sheer size of the country while still expressing confidence that the campaign's objectives were achievable within that window. Whether that 4-week estimate held up as the war dragged on into its later, more prolonged phases is a separate question entirely. But it tells you that American military planning going into this stretch of escalation was built around an expectation of a relatively contained timeline, one that the Qatar strike and its aftermath complicated considerably by widening the war's scope beyond the purely military targets that timeline had originally been built around. It is also worth acknowledging, honestly, just how unusual it was for Washington to simultaneously threaten Iran with the total destruction of South Pars, while also quietly restraining Israel from launching a second strike on the exact same site. That is not the behavior of an administration simply looking for an excuse to escalate as far and as fast as possible. It reflects a genuine attempt at containment, an effort to draw a very specific, very public red line, hit Qatar's energy infrastructure again, and face total destruction of your own largest gas field, while simultaneously trying to prevent the other half of the equation, continued Israeli strikes on that same field, from reigniting the exact cycle that had produced the Qatar attack in the first place. Whether that kind of calibrated deterrence actually holds over time is always an open question in a conflict this volatile, but the attempt itself tells you something important about how seriously the administration understood the stakes involved in letting a war over missile sites and command centers spill over into a war over the world's energy supply. Because that, ultimately, is what makes the Qatar strike such a genuinely pivotal moment in this entire conflict, more significant in some ways than many of the individual military engagements that generated far more dramatic footage. Command centers and missile depots, however important strategically, are military assets, understood by everyone involved to be legitimate targets in an active war. The moment Iran extended its retaliation to the largest LNG export facility on the planet, located in a country that had not fired a single shot in this entire conflict, the war crossed into a different category entirely, one where global energy security itself became a hostage to the broader Israeli-Iranian confrontation. And the American response, both the explicit threat to level South Pars entirely and the accelerated military campaign grinding down Iran's missile and drone infrastructure night after night, reflected a recognition that letting that particular line get crossed without a serious, credible consequence attached to it would only invite more of the same, dragging every neutral Gulf state deeper and deeper into a fight that was never originally theirs. It's also worth noting how this single incident fits into the war's much larger arc of casualty reporting, from Iran's side specifically, since the strikes on Kuwait around this same period produced some of the more granular, individually documented American losses of the entire early war. 6 U.S. soldiers were killed at Port Shuaibah near a civilian port in Kuwait on the 1st of March, identified individually in official reporting. Major Jeffrey O'Brien, 45, Chief Warrant Officer 3, Robert Marzan, 54, among others whose names were released as the Pentagon worked through its casualty notification process. Those individually documented losses, appearing in official operational updates rather than just aggregate statistics, are part of what made this early stretch of the war feel so immediately consequential to the American public, even before the Qatar energy strike pulled global markets and neutral third-party nations directly into the crossfire. Combined with the destruction of a $900 million class missile warning radar in Jordan and the potential damage to an even more expensive early warning system in Qatar, this period represents one of the most materially costly stretches of the entire conflict for the American side, in dollars, in equipment, and in lives, all compressed into just a few short weeks at the very start of a war that would go on to last considerably longer than anyone initially projected. So where did all of this actually leave the war as it moved past this specific chapter? Iran's launch tempo kept declining under sustained American and Allied pressure, even as its rhetoric remained as aggressive as ever. Qatar, having been burned once, kept a much closer watch on its own energy infrastructure while continuing its role as a diplomatic go-between, the same role that would eventually help shape ceasefire negotiations later in the war. The presidential threat against South Pars never had to be carried out, at least not in the immediate aftermath, suggesting either that the deterrence held or that other factors kept Iran from testing it again in the following days. And the broader American campaign against Iran's military command and control infrastructure, the same campaign that had already reduced Tehran's strike capacity by the vast majority within just the first weeks of fighting, continued grinding forward, setting the stage for the even longer, more sustained rounds of conflict that would follow in the months ahead. What this entire episode really reveals, when you step back and look at the full picture, rather than just the dramatic headline of a gas facility on fire, is how quickly a war fought primarily over missile sites and leadership decapitation can suddenly expand to threaten the actual economic infrastructure the entire world depends on, and how fast a superpower's response can shift from measured retaliation to an explicit public threat of total destruction the moment that line gets crossed. Iran's decision to hit Ras Laffan was a calculated gamble, an attempt to make Israel's strike on South Pars costly for someone, anyone, even if that someone was an uninvolved neutral party sitting right next door. What it actually bought Iran was a direct, public, unmistakable threat from the President of the United States himself, an accelerated military campaign that kept dismantling its own strike capacity month after month, and a diplomatic rupture with a country that had, until that point, been one of the few remaining bridges between Tehran and the outside world. I want to know how you're reading this specific chapter of the war, looking back at it now. Do you think the American threat to level South Pars entirely was the right kind of deterrence, the sort of unmistakable red line that actually prevents further escalation? Or does that level of threatened destruction risk pushing an already cornered regime toward even more desperate and unpredictable retaliation the next time it feels boxed in? Drop your thoughts down in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of moment in a long, grinding conflict where the specific choices made in a single 48-hour window end up shaping the trajectory of everything that follows for months afterward. If breakdowns like this, grounded in the actual verified numbers and statements rather than just the dramatic footage everyone already saw, help you understand how this war has actually unfolded, go ahead and subscribe, because there is a lot more of this story still to unpack as new chapters keep developing. And if you know someone who remembers the oil price spike from this exact stretch of the war but never quite understood what was actually happening behind it, send this their way, because the real story here is about a gas field on a maritime border, a president's public warning, and a military campaign that was already working exactly as intended, even as the headlines kept getting louder. Because, at the end of the day, this is the pattern that has defined so much of this entire conflict. A strike against a legitimate military or strategic target triggers a disproportionate response against an uninvolved neighbor. That response triggers an even more forceful counter-threat from the country with the most firepower in the room. And underneath all of that dramatic, headline-grabbing escalation, a quieter, more methodical military campaign keeps grinding forward, steadily reducing the actual capacity of the side, making the loudest threats to follow through on any of them. The Qatar energy strike and everything that followed it captures that entire dynamic in a single, tightly compressed window of time. And it remains one of the clearest examples in this whole war of just how fast a regional conflict can threaten to become a genuinely global one, and just how quickly a credible, forceful response can pull that threat back from the brink, at least for the moment. Let me know your predictions and your read on this whole chapter down in the comments. Like this video, if the verified numbers here helped you actually understand what happened during this stretch of the war better than the headlines alone ever did. And share it with anyone still trying to piece together why oil prices spiked the way they did during this exact window. I'll see you in the next one as this story keeps developing. And thank you genuinely for sticking with a breakdown this detailed instead of settling for a 15-second clip of a fire burning at a gas plant.